Okay, so welcome everyone. Anyway, it's recorded, so let's start on time.
Yep.
And not rush. My name is Alexandre Fayolle. You may know me because I've been a long-standing member of the OCA. Also, as part of the OCA organization, in charge of maintaining the runbot.odoo community.org. Okay, so our own runbot. And so I thought, okay, I get requests privately by a number of people asking, okay, can you help me set up my own runbot? So I decided to propose a talk here for the OCA to at least get some documentation about that. What are the targets of this training session? I'm going to show you how to install your Runbot instance. Okay, so this will cover the Odoo setup, PostgreSQL setup, Nginx setup, Docker setup, and a little bit of GitHub at the end. And most importantly, understand the concepts used by Runbot. Okay, and we'll try and see how you can configure your projects to be able to test them with your own Runbot. Now, the thing is, Runbot is an old project. It started in, I think, in 2015. And there's been some huge evolutions. And if you're using the odoo.com Runbot, you may have seen, okay, I have to get out of Discord because this is going to be unbearable. Sorry about that. Yeah, there's been some great evolutions lately on the Runbot. So in this presentation, we'll be using the latest version of Runbot. So
Alex,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you show the slides full screen until you switch to something else?
Probably like that.
Better, thanks.
Okay. Can I do this? Yes. Okay. The latest version is the version 5 of Runbot, and this is what we're going to use in this session. So, important note, this is not the current setup of the OCA Runbot. The OCA Runbot runs on Odoo 11, using the latest version of the Runbot before the Runbot switched to Docker. Okay, so if you expect to be running the same version as the OCA, well, you can leave for track 1. I still think the latest version is great. I still don't have figured it out all, but there are lots of things. It's a very powerful tool. So we'll be using that version. What you need to know is some Linux system administration. Okay, I won't explain everything about Nginx, Docker, and PostgreSQL. I'll show you what the values I use in my configuration files are. Okay, and you need to have some previous knowledge of Odoo administration and setup to be able to run everything. Some credits, because I didn't write a single line of the Odoo Runbot. So first thing, I want to thank the Odoo developers who made the Runbot possible. Okay, and you can check them on the on GitHub. XMO-Odoo is one of the core developers of the last version. A special mention for Olivier Donny, who helped me when I first started on Runbot for the OCA. Okay, and I wouldn't have been able to run such a beast without his help. So thanks a lot to Olivier. And also thanks a lot for a great community member, Moises Lopez, who works at Voxu. Okay, and he wrote Travis to Docker, and that's a key component of our current OCA Runbot. So I wanted to give him a little bit of spotlight here, because his work is great. Even though it will need serious reworking if we migrate to the version 5 of Runbot. More on this later. So first thing you want to know is, okay, how is the Runbot organized? And yes, I have, can you see my mouse? Okay, yeah, I suppose so. So here
yes,
we have...
we do, Alex. When
yes?
you don't move it, we see it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's there.
So the Runbot is made to work with several Odoo servers connected to the same PostgreSQL database. Okay. So we have a database server which runs the main Odoo instance database, which we'll be calling RunbotDB later on. Okay. And these different servers are connected to the same database. It works in the same way as one single server with different workers, okay, which share a same connection to a single database. And this allows to scale the Runbot, okay, because these servers are going to trigger builds, and these builds will be running inside Dockers, and all the builds running on a single Runbot node will be accessing their own database running on a local database server on the Runbot node. Okay, so you have first to understand how this is architectured. There are two, at least, PostgreSQL databases. Okay, one for the Runbot itself, and one for each build which is triggered by the Runbot. And typically, they don't run on the same PostgreSQL cluster. Second thing you are noticing here is that the builds are running on Docker, but the Odoo Runbot itself is not. Okay, I strongly advise not to run the Runbot inside Docker. Okay, if only because you'll be saving a lot of time figuring out how to have Docker control Docker. Okay, maybe if you're a better Docker wizard than I am, you'll find a way. I didn't spend the time looking for this. So we'll be seeing how to install Odoo without Docker, which is maybe something which is a lost ability these days. Okay. So for each node, okay, you will need different things. First thing you'll need is a DNS entry, because this is going to be live on the internet. People are going to connect to Runbot builds. Okay, so you need a DNS entry. So you'll need some control over the DNS server. You need a little bit of disk space, okay, to store the Docker images, the Docker data, and the databases. Okay, but generally, this won't be the limiting factor these days, because a 500 gigabytes hard disk drive is quite cheap. On the other hand, you will need a lot of RAM, okay, lots of memory. Each Runbot build consumes around 800 megabytes of RAM. Okay, so if you want 10 builds, you need 8 gigabytes just for the Runbot. And then you need additional RAM for the database server and Docker and the main Runbot instance. For the record, the OCA infrastructure uses 3 servers, 2 of which have 128 gigabytes of RAM, and the third one has only 64 gigabytes. And it's a bit stressful, and we're able to run around, I don't remember how many builds we have. We'll have to look it up. But that's the main limiting factor. Okay. Thirdly, then you need some CPU, okay, because running the tests, if you want the test to run fast enough, you need some CPU power, okay. And if you want the Runbot builds to be usable by people who connect to them, you need some CPU. Finally, you need a good internet connection because you'll be cloning things over the internet all the time, and people may be accessing your Runbots. So a good bandwidth is okay. Now, for something which runs in the LAN, well, your LAN is probably well enough. Also, you're able to run the Runbot on a simple server. So your laptop is probably well enough to run a test build. Okay. I will be using a demo server I've set up for this. Okay, it's a very lightweight and cheap server because I'm not using this for live builds. So it only has 2 ARM RAM cores at 1.7 gigahertz and 4 gigabytes of RAM. And that's low, but for running 2 builds in parallel and 3 or 4 runs, that's plenty. Okay, the builds are super slow, on the other hand. Okay, the CPU is not powerful enough to run the tests in a fast way. So first thing, DNS. Try setting your hosts as named as runbot plus number at .yourdomain.org. Okay, this will help a lot when checking your various hosts. Okay, and add a CNAME, okay, an alias for one of the nodes that will be used as a public front end. So nickname it Runbot. For instance, below we have the names, the DNS configuration for the OCA runbots. So you see the A records for runbot 1, 2, and 3. Okay, runbot is also a CNAME, an alias for runbot 1. And we will be using wildcards for each node, and these will host the this will be the host names for the builds. Okay, we'll be generating lots of builds with the host name, and we'll be using a feature of Odoo that's native, and it's been here for since version, I don't know, 6 or 7. If you access Odoo through such a name, it can parse the name to find the database name. So it's a nice feature. Then on each node, you'll need a few packages. You'll need Git, obviously, because you'll be pulling Git repository. You need PostgreSQL to host the build databases. You need Nginx for the reverse proxy. You need Python 3 to run Odoo, and you need Docker to run the builds. Okay, so Docker generally has special instructions to set up because it's normally not available in your Linux distribution, but the other packages are available normally in your Linux distribution, so you should use that to install it. For Docker, please follow this instruction. I mean, add the proper repository and use whatever installation instruction in there. PostgreSQL. So we've seen that there's 2 PostgreSQL setups required. The first one is for the global database that will host the Odoo, the Runbot database, the main Runbot instance. Okay, so we will call this instance runbotdb here. Okay, and this has to be available to all the Runbot nodes. Okay, so if you are running on a restricted setup, such as we will have here, okay, and we'll be running that database on one of the nodes, okay, I recommend using a different PostgreSQL cluster, which doesn't run on the default port, okay, 5432, because this default port is hard-coded, and this is the port used for hosting the run databases. Okay, so in the example, we'll be using 5444. So we'll be creating that cluster, okay, and then you need to create a database user, and it has to be called Odoo, It's way simpler later. It reduces the number of things you have to tweak. Okay, you have to create a database called Runbot DB. Okay, you can choose whatever name you want, and create a database for the user also. So give it the same name as the user, and for both, set user Odoo as the owner. Then you want to edit the PostgreSQL.conf file, okay, to listen on a public network interface, because you will be connecting to that database server from the other nodes. Okay. To protect it, allow SSL in there, and then edit the pghba.conf. Okay, that's a file which controls which remote hosts are able to connect to which databases, and allow access to the databases Odoo, Postgres, and RunbotDB from other nodes for other Odoo. Okay, and you need to edit this file each time you add a node, or you can add permissions to connect from wherever you want. It depends on your system administration policies here. So how does it look like? On my server, I connect as user Postgres. I use pg-create cluster to create a new cluster. Okay, that should be 11 for Debian Buster. Never mind. Okay, I create a new cluster. I start it. I create user Odoo. I create database Odoo with owner Odoo. I create database runbotdb with user Odoo. And in my pghba.conf, I allow connecting from my various hosts, my different nodes. Okay, so that's for my global database. Then on each node, I need to do the setup again. Okay, and for the nodes, we need to have a PostgreSQL cluster listening on the default port, so 5432. On that cluster, I want to have a user called Odoo. Okay, and this user must be able to create a new database. Okay. That's the bare minimum. If you're planning to use this for a non-demo, okay, you will need some tuning of your database, okay, because your database server will be supporting potentially a lot of connections. So in the PostgreSQL configuration, you want to increase max connections. By default, it's 100, and by default, an Odoo server opens, I think, 16 connections. So with 10 builds, you have totally exploded that. If needed, you want to decrease workmem, okay, because workmem is allocated for each connection. And this will significantly eat up your resources, okay, and RAM is expensive, so you want to decrease this to be able to still run and not crash. In any case, we don't need a lot of workmem because the memory consumption is going to be quite low. It's not going to be a production server running. It's going to be a test instance and then a runbot run. Okay, and we don't want to have super fast performances here. And in that regard, we'll be disabling the fsync parameter. Okay, and because fsync waits for the data to be committed to disk before closing a transaction, we don't care about data integrity in there. Okay, if a runbot run gets corrupted, or we don't care, it's not live production. And in the same vein, we'll be disabling track counts and auto vacuum because we don't care about the statistics for the optimizer, and we don't want the PG auto vacuum, PostgreSQL auto vacuum daemon to run each time we create a new database. So on my node, I create my user with create DB privileges, and I create a database Odoo, owned by Odoo, if only to allow him to connect without any database. So the listen addresses, this is used for connecting from within the Docker. Okay, SSL equals true allows SSL encryption, and then you see I've increased my max connection to 2000 and decreased work mem to 4 megabytes. Okay, fsync off, track counts off, O2 vacuum off. Docker setup. Once you've installed Docker with any recent Docker version, okay, the only thing you need to do is to add the Odoo user to the Docker group. Okay, and this is enough to have Odoo be able to work with Docker. I'm not sure I mentioned that. The Odoo user, the user that you will use to run the Runbot, has to be called Odoo, because this username is hard-coded in some places inside inside the Runbot. Okay, so you can't have it called Runbot, or don't try to run Runbot as your own user on your own laptop. You'll have issues. It took me a couple of hours to figure out why my builds were not working, and one of the causes was I was running as my user. Nginx. Okay. So if you remember this diagram, okay, so you have your Odoo, which runs Runbot, okay, and you will need first one Nginx to access this Odoo, okay, one reverse proxy, which listens on port 80, okay, and reverse proxies the default port 3069 on which the Odoo server listens. And the Odoo Runbot for each build is going to generate an Nginx configuration. Okay, and this Nginx configuration takes care of these setups here. Okay, sorry, the virtual host name, okay, which encodes the database name. So and it also manages a reverse proxy listening on port 8080. Okay, so what you have is Odoo generates an Nginx configuration file, which reverse proxies the 3069 port on port 8080, and also redirects the connections to the builds, okay, on port 8069. So you don't need anything to do that. Okay, it's handled by you, and Odoo will manage reloading the Nginx configuration for you. What you need to do is to install a second layer of reverse proxy to listen on port 80, possibly handle SSL and HTTPS and SSL certificates. I won't go into SSL here. Okay, you have all the tutorials you want to use Let's Encrypt, for instance. What you should not do is try to change the QWeb template to directly reverse proxy listening on port 80, okay, because this is a privileged port and you need to be root to listen on that port. If you want to do this, you need to also hack the way the Runbot starts the Nginx, okay, and that's not the nicest way. I mean, the best way is to have your own Nginx set up for this part of the reverse proxying. So globally, what I did in my demo, I edited the default site because I was lazy. Okay, and the default reverse proxies port 8080. Okay, if you want to copy this, you obviously need to change the DNS here. Okay. What we also do, okay, is remove the long polling ports. Okay, return 404. We don't need the chat on our Runbot. And we also disallow robots. Okay. Then we need to reverse proxy the builds. Okay. So on the server listening on port 80, if the server name matches something.runbotng1.odoocommunity.net, okay, then this is passed to the same server on which the user tried to connect, port 8080, and that's forwarded to the Nginx run started by Odoo. Okay. Yep. And finally, that's and there's a typo here because this should be with a lowercase l. Sorry. Okay, and finally, you need to tell Nginx how to resolve build name.runbotng1.odoocommunity.net. Okay, and this is done by setting a resolver in the HTTP section. Okay, so that's in the global nginx.conf on a Debian distribution, and I added that line in my setup to give Nginx the information about DNS servers. Okay, so that Nginx is able to find the servers by making a DNS query. Okay, and when we've done all this, we reach the Odoo setup. Okay. So my advice is there's a readme.md file in the Runbot repository. Okay, so the Runbot repository is on github.com/odoo/runbot. Okay, and also we'll be covering lots of ground here. Please read the file. I mean, it's mostly accurate. Okay, there's a few things that I found while writing the presentation, and I'm preparing a pull request to improve this. But hopefully, by the time you set up your own Runbot, the PR will have been submitted and merged. And it has some very valuable advice, so read it. What you will need to do also, yes, you should not, I repeat here, do not run Odoo for your Runbot inside Docker. You'll have lots of issues, okay, and it won't work in the end unless you're a Docker wizard. So do it the old-fashioned way. Create a virtual environment for Python 3. Okay, clone Odoo and Odoo Runbot. Okay, branch 13, and do it the normal way. I mean, you maybe can use the pip install Odoo if you want. See Daniel's presentation from yesterday, but that's mostly it. I created a small repository to help. So it's here. Okay, maybe should I zoom in a bit? So that's Gorniale Alex, that's me, Runbot setup. I'll be putting the slides for the presentation here too, if you need. Okay, what it does, it has two submodules for Odoo and Runbot, okay, and a couple of scripts which are helpful for doing the setup. The first script is install deps, okay, and that's on a Debian stable the packages you need to install to be able to pip install the dependencies of Odoo. Okay, and it has a requirements.txt file, okay, that you can use, and install.sh, okay, does create the virtual env for you. Okay, it activates it, it pip installs lots of things, and it creates a first configuration file called runbot.conf, okay, with a number of parameters that you can pass on as environment variables here, okay, and others, especially the limits. Okay, these limits come from the Runbot repository README. Okay, here. Okay, so it's a helper. It still have some rough edges. Okay, if you find it useful and want to contribute, please make a pull request and ping me, and we can discuss things and improve it together. Okay, and probably there's a README also, but that's mostly notes I took while I was making the presentation. So the presentation is probably more complete. There. Okay. So what does it look like? You clone the Runbot setup. Okay. You clone it. I use recurse submodules, shallow submodules, jobs do, because that's fancy. Okay. I put that in a Mr. Runbot directory. In that Mr. Runbot, I install deps. Okay. And then I run install sh saying, okay, this is going to be running on db.mydomain.org. That's the host of the main Runbot database. The database port is going to be 5444, and the database password is the password of my Odoo user over there. Then you can change the runbot.conf. You have to change the admin password. You can tune log levels, and I think I've forgotten to enable the proxy mode in my script. So I'll fix that after the presentation. And then you can source the activate file in your virtual environment and just start Odoo using /run.sh. Okay, and what run.sh does is simply find the run.conf file. Okay, export the run.conf file as the Odoo RC environment variable, and start things using src Odoo bin, and you can pass whatever command line options you want afterwards. Okay. When you start Odoo, it will probably start doing things, or maybe you need to activate some parameters first. We'll see that a bit later. I don't remember exactly at which step these initializations happen. What you want to keep in mind is, so you have Mr. Runbot, that's where I clone my repository. src Runbot is the submodule for the Runbot repository. The Runbot here is the Runbot add-on in the Runbot submodule. Okay, and in that add-on you have a static directory. The static directory is where Odoo and the Runbot is going to put a lot of things. Okay, especially if you check that directory on a running instance of Runbot, you have a builds subdirectory, and you have one directory for each build. And in that directory, you will find potentially a dump of the database after the tests have run. You will find the logs. Okay, if you need to check them and for some reason you have a wrong setup in your Nginx configuration, you want to check the logs, they are in that directory. You have a Docker subdirectory which contains a Docker file which is used to build the instances. You have this Nginx directory which contains the Nginx configuration generated by Odoo. Okay. You have a repo subdirectory, and this is where all the repositories that we'll be configuring are going to be cloned. Okay, and finally you have the sources. Okay, and this is the actual branch clones for the repositories. Okay, these are used for building the Docker images for running the tests. Okay, so this is where you will have some disk usage. Also, if you need to clean up stuff because you're running out of disk space, check the static subdirectory of the Runbot add-on. Okay. So now, where do we stand? We have all the sysadministration part done, and we have our Runbot up and running. So we now need to configure it, because by default, you don't have any repository configured here. So you'll have to connect. Be careful, this is potentially a public server, so don't forget to change the admin password on your first connection. Because otherwise you'll have people doing funky stuff on your Runbot server. Second thing you want to know is the Runbot add-ons changes stuff in the way Odoo works, okay, especially regarding the crons. And there is one cron for Runbot. First thing which is done is it changes the frequencies to allow a period in seconds. So this cron is started every 10 seconds. But it has a specific behavior which make it run for a long time and stop after by itself after a period. So by doing this, it runs in its own transaction, and it means that if you change some parameters in the global settings, they've been run by the cron, which is potentially currently running. Okay, and since they've been read, the read repeatable transaction isolation level makes it so that they are not reread. Okay, so if you change the parameters, you will likely require to restart your Odoo server because before you can see anything happening. Okay, and this can be with the default setting something like 1 hour and a half. So that's long. First thing, so when you change the settings, adding a repository is not changing a setting. Adding a repository will work, but for instance, saying that a branch should also check for pull requests is a change which requires restarting for immediate effect. Okay. Second thing you need to change and to do manually because it's not available through a setting is to add an IR config parameter, so that the system configuration parameters, called runbot.runbot Nginx, and set it to value 1. So this changes the way some of the fields are computed, mostly the names of the builds. Okay, and that's used for the Nginx and reverse proxying. It's not required if you just want to test Runbot on your workstation, but if you've done all the setup with Nginx we did before, you need to do it. Okay, and there's a big to-do in the source code of Runbot saying, okay, publish this somewhere, make it available through the interface. It's not done yet, so it took me a while to figure out also why I was not able to configure my Nginx properly. So save some time. Okay, and then you're able to connect to Runbot, and when you do so, you will land on the settings page. Okay, and the settings page. But by the way, if you want to test it, okay, I have this up and running today. Probably it won't last for long. Okay, but it's available on runbot-ng.odoo-community.net, not .org. Okay, it's .net. And you have this page available. Okay, the admin password is, well, you don't need it actually. And I will show you the internal part. Okay, it's not admin. It's an community edition instance. We don't have enterprise here. So when you log in, you'll land on the settings page of the Runbot, and you see here the menu. Okay, the first entry is settings, and you have the resconfig settings page. What you need to change at least is these two settings. These two boxes by default are unchecked, and you want to check discover new commit and schedule builds, otherwise nothing will happen on your instance. You will also want on a real production server to change these two values. So these are made for a local test on a small machine. Okay. Number of workers is typically in the order of magnitude of the number of cores you have on your server. Okay. And max number of running builds depends on the amount of memory you have available. This can be overridden per host. More on this a bit later. And then you have a number of parameters which are related to cleanup. Okay, the max commit age, update frequency, days before garbage collection, etc. Okay, and a setting related to timeout. I haven't played with that yet. And you want also to change the Runbot domain to use the front end. Okay, and by default you'll have the name of the first node that you set up. The regex is base. Well, you can change it. If you are not interested in the source branches, remove this bit. Okay. On the first start of Odoo, of the Runbot, you will have a new build host created. Okay, and each time you start the Runbot server on a new node, the node will register itself as a Runbot host. Okay, with its host name, and the host name is going to be the FQDN, the fully qualified domain name of the server. Okay, so if you if you use host name FQDN, okay, that's the one you will get. Okay, and that's normally the first entry in the etc hosts file. Okay, this one. Okay, and the thing you want to check is this setting here, only accept assigned builds, okay, which needs to be unchecked. It is unchecked by default, as far as I've been able to figure out. Okay, but if it's since the builds, and we'll see what the builds are a bit later, are not assigned by default, if you don't do anything special, okay, you won't get that. It can be used if you have, I don't know, specific database templates for on specific hosts, on specific nodes, for instance, to speed up things or whatever. okay, or dedicated resources for some kind of projects. But this is not something you get by default. So it's a feature which can be used with specific configurations. We won't deal too much in this here. Okay. Right. Okay, now there are a number of models which are brought by the Runbot modules, and we are going to run through most of them here in this talk. The first concept is the project. So the project is a global configuration for the Runbot, okay, and it will group a number of things such as repositories, triggers, bundles, and builds, and we'll see all these concepts a bit later. The important thing is when you are, oh, and there's also this little dash here on the back end, which brings you to the front end, and that's nice. You will get here one short link for each project. Okay. So obviously you cannot have hundreds of projects because the UI will be terrible, but normally you should be able to run most of things with a single project. Okay. Also, what you may be interested in, it's possible to allow only members of some groups to see a project. Okay, so this is, as far as I've been able to figure out, the Runbot is a key component of Odoo SH. Okay, and when you're using Odoo SH, you are not browsing anonymously. Okay, so you have a user, and this user is tied to a group, and the group can be used to segregate projects. Okay, and you only see the projects which belong to your group. So you could use this to provide a Runbot in your company and to have one Runbot or one project per customer, and your customer sees only his project. So a project screen, okay, by default you have the R&D project, okay, you have these required groups. If it's empty, anyone can access it. And we'll see we can see the triggers for that project, and more on the triggers just after that. The second thing you need to configure is a repository. The repositories are you have one repository per GitHub project. So I need to edit the wording here. It's not the project from here, it's a GitHub project. Don't use spaces in the name of your repository. Again, I lost 45 minutes looking, trying to figure out why my builds were failing. It's because spaces are not properly handled by the shell commands which are run by the Runbot. Maybe I'll propose a fix for that. But yeah, don't. Slashes are properly handled, but not spaces. So in a repository, let's move back here. You have various fields. Runbot. Repositories. So you will need to have at least one repository for Odoo or for a clone of Odoo. Okay, so here I'm using Odoo, okay, and this repository must have this entry field in the server files, tells Runbot, what is the command, the file inside the repository which is used to run Odoo. Okay, so in recent versions of Odoo, it's odoo-bin. You have a manifest file, and this is how to tell Odoo how to find what are add-ons repositories in your clone. Okay, because in older versions of Odoo, the manifest file was openerp.py. And you can have also an add-ons path, and the add-ons path is where are the add-ons located in that repository. Okay, so if you can leave that empty, and it means that all the add-ons are in the root of the repository. Modules to install, we'll see that a bit later. Okay, the mode here tells how to find new commits. Okay, so there are three values: disabled, poll, and hook. Okay, you can only use poll if you are not in control of the repository. Okay, so for Odoo, I cannot add hooks on that repository, so I have to use poll. And we'll be using hooks, and we'll see how to configure them at the end of the training for repositories that you control. Okay. And for each repository, you will add remotes. Okay. And the remote gives you where to clone the repository from. Okay. So here I'm adding the Odoo repository on GitHub. And on each remote, I can select if I want to handle branches or also pull requests on that repository. Okay, and obviously I don't want to build the Odoo pull request, so I leave this out. Okay, and I'll keep yes, discard. Okay, and for my test repository here, I will want also to build the pull requests. The identity file here is the name of an SSH public key file. Okay, and this name is looked for in the home of the odoo user.ssh directory. Sorry. And okay, so it needs to be, it's a file name and not the content of the public key that you need to put here. And it's also linked to a project. Okay, you can have a regular expression which forbids some of the branches. Okay, so if you don't want branches which are prefixed with test to be considered, you can have this here. Okay, and the forbidden branch message will be used to say in the bundles why we are not considering a given branch, and we'll see the bundles a bit later. So this is for the main Odoo. Okay, and for my test branch, okay, here I have created a small repository with one module coming from I think it's sale workflows from the OCA. Okay, that I copy pasted just for testing and for having something quick. Okay, so that's my test runbot repository. I own it, so I can add hooks on it. Okay, and I have my remote configured properly. You can have several remotes here, but you have to be a little bit careful because there's a concept which is not displayed anywhere, but which is really important. It's the main remote on a repository. So the first time you add a remote on a repository, it becomes the main remote. Okay, and the main remote has some special properties, and it's used to manage the base branches for the pull requests. So you need to add the main reference repository first when adding branches, or you need to remove all your remotes and re-add them in the correct order before for builds to be processed properly. Again, this is something which cost me 2 hours to figure out. So if I can save you a little bit of time here, I'm happy. What else do I have on repositories? Yes, the identity file, it's used if you're using SSH for your remote. Okay, if you're using HTTPS, then you're safe. And the modules to install is a list of modules that you can that you will want to install when running an OL setup. Okay, and you can disable some modules by prefixing the names with a dash, and you can use star as a wildcard. So if you check here my Odoo repository, my modules to install here is dash star comma base. It means that when running the OL step of a build, I will not be installing all the Odoo add-ons. I will only be installing base, and this saves a lot of time. And that way, I'll be only installing the dependencies of the add-ons in my test Runbot repository. Okay, so this is a nice way of speeding up things. You don't have to use this if you want to install all modules, please do, but you'll get something very crowded when testing your own repositories. Okay. So when looking at a repository, when finding new commits, the branches will trigger possibly new bundles and builds, and we'll see that just now. So the next concept is a trigger. So Odoo Runbot is trying to monitor what's happening on your repositories. Okay, and the trigger makes the link between repositories which are going to work together. Okay, so in a trigger, you have two sets of repositories. You have the triggers repositories, can't click here, okay, and you have the dependencies. So these work together, and in your triggers, you will, what you say is, if something happens, so a new pull request or a new branch or a new commit on a branch in one of the trigger repository, I will create a new batch, okay, in my Runbot, and this batch will eventually create a new build. Okay, and the batch will be using the dependencies of the trigger to fill in what's missing. Okay, so generally you will have Odoo as your dependencies. You could also have here Odoo as a trigger. Okay, and this means that if I get a new commit in Odoo, this will trigger eventually a new build. Whereas if in this setup, I only trigger a new build when something happens on my test Runbot repository. Okay, and you see that this screenshot was made before I found out that spaces were not supported, and I renamed that in my instance afterwards. Okay, So depending on what you want to have, okay, if you want to be sure that if I change something in Odoo, I'm not breaking my test runbot, I need to move my dependency to the triggers, my Odoo dependency to the triggers. Otherwise, I only get a new build when I test my runbot. Okay. Config here, okay, default, is the build configuration which is going to be used by the builds triggered by that trigger. Okay. The category here, you have default, nightly, and weekly, which are the default categories. As far as I can tell, these only set an icon on the front end. Okay, and it doesn't actually work on changing the period of the build. So I think that on Runbot, there are different mechanisms which are used and which are not enabled by default, or that you need to tweak. Okay. And at the bottom of the screen, there are some CI fields, and these are used for reporting the build results on GitHub. And there are other upgrade steps, templates, etc., that I have not looked into so far. But Runbot is also able to run upgrades. Possibly it only works with the Odoo upgrade scripts. And if someone wants to look at how we can make Open Upgrade work with this, potentially it's something which would be nice to have, and we could have an OCA add-on for that. Okay, so your trigger has a build config. So what is a build config? The build config is a list of all the build steps that will be performed by a build. So each step can have different type, okay, so build step type. So it can be run step, it can be run Odoo, it can trigger another build, it can trigger a version upgrade, it can restore a database, and even there is a power type which allows to run Python code. Okay, so this allows some really powerful mechanisms. Okay, for instance, you can introspect the content of a commit, okay, and trigger the creation of other builds, for instance, with custom steps. Okay, and I will have to investigate this for upgrading the Odoo community Runbot to the latest version, because this is really powerful and can get us free of a number of tweaks we have locally. And in the testing steps, you can list the modules to run the test on, or to run some tests filtered by tags. Okay, and that's also a very nice feature. So in my config, so here we have the build configs. So by default, you get an 7 configuration, default no run, okay, test coverage, test the localization tags, okay. And here for, okay, that's maybe not the easiest one. The default that we're using says, okay, install base, and then run all tests, and then run the Runbot. So if you want to, you don't care about running all the tests, you can remove that step for your Runbot, install base, and then run, for instance. Okay, create a new one. The build config steps look like this. So for instance, all. Okay, the step name is all, and the job type is test Odoo. And as I said, you can have several different test job types, and probably you can add our own job types in extension modules if needed, but the Python code job type is probably powerful enough. And for a test module, you can say what the database name is, and you can use the modules to install. So by default, you'll get star. Okay, but you could have different different setups for that. Okay, and possibly we could have another Python code job type which looks for a file in a repository which lists the modules to test, for instance. Okay, and you have a number of other variables. Okay, if you have a Python code, okay, you have a Python code to run things and a Python code to test the results. So it can be used, for instance, to run black on your repository, and this could be really helpful, or run some CI tools or linters, etc. Okay. So build step. Okay. So now we have triggers, and the triggers have trigger repositories and dependency repositories. When something happens on one of the trigger repositories, okay, we will use the trigger repositories and the dependency repositories to manage a bundle. Okay, the bundle is a group of branches which are found on a repository that work together in a project. So by default, it's all the branches with the same name which belong to a same trigger. Okay, and you also have special bundles for pull requests. Okay, and these refer to a base bundle, and the base bundle is used to get the parts which are not part of the pull requests, okay, the other repositories, and generally the main Odoo instance. So a bundle for a branch, okay, so that's branch 13.0, has, okay, a project, of course, a base bundle, which is itself, okay, a bundle version, which is 13.0, and the branches are the branches 13.0 of my dependency and my trigger repository. Okay, and we see in which repository, in which remote they are found. And sorry, here. Okay, whereas a bundle for a pull request, okay, this one is called, it's unreadable here, 13.0 fix module. Okay, and the base bundle is the 13.0 bundle we've seen here. Okay, you don't have the Odoo branch because it's not concerned by the pull request. You just have the branch for the test repository for Runbot repository. Okay, and the other branches are found from the base bundle. Nice thing here is if you have several pull requests referring with the same name, they will, on different trigger repositories, they will be grouped in the same bundle. Okay, so I think Odoo uses that if they have a feature branch on Odoo and a feature branch on Enterprise. If these two branches have the same name, they will get in the same bundle and be tested together. Okay, so thinking of the OCA Runbot, when you have dependent pull requests, okay, you have something, a pull request in a save workflow, which depends on a pull request on, I don't know, product attributes. If you have the both branches on the having the same name, we could have them tested simultaneously together. I think I haven't tested that. Okay, and so I have my bundle, and this will generate batches. Okay, what's a batch? A batch, so the bundle groups branches. Okay, the batch groups commits. Okay, so because your branch or your pull request will be updated, for instance, if the CI fails, you will get a new commit on your branch. Okay, this will not create a new bundle, but it will create a new batch linked to that bundle. So when Runbot discovers branches in your repositories, it creates a bundle. And when Runbot discovers new commits on a branch, okay, it will find the bundle and create a new batch. Okay, and then there's a small trick here to avoid creating thousands of batch each time you push a new commit. Okay, because often you create a commit, you push, and you say, oh my God, I forgot to add that file. So you git add the file, git commit amend git push force, or git commit fix up, okay, git push, and that's done in 15 seconds. So there's a timeout. When a new batch is created, okay, it checks if the batch has been created for more than 60 seconds and nothing has happened on the branch. If a new commit arrives within 60 seconds, okay, it's added to the batch, and we don't create a build until nothing has happened during 1 minute. Okay, and only when nothing has happened during 1 minute do we create a new build. Okay, so a batch, so the bundle groups branches, the batch groups commits, and here you see the commits. They are really not nice, okay, but it's not meant to be seen by the user. So you see which commits SHA-1s are used, and you don't really have the branch name here, but it's available in the models anyway. And this will trigger a build. Okay, the build slots, I won't deal into that concept too much, but it's used to limit the number of builds running simultaneously. So they have a state for the build. And the builds are finally what you are really interested in. That's what you want to get when you set up a Runbot. So a build applies the build configuration from the trigger to a batch, okay, and runs the various steps listed in the build configuration on the commits of the batch. And these steps are run in Docker containers. And the front end has a rich view allowing you to see what is happening on a build. Okay. And if there's a run step, you are also able to log on the instance. Okay. You can see the logs from the front end, and you can download a dump of the database after a step has ended. Okay, so this is helpful if you, I don't know, maybe the build failed and you want to check what's inside the database to understand what happened. Okay, so you can do this from the front end of the Runbot. Okay, this is what it looks like. So this is a build for a pull request. Okay, I changed the commit is update readme. Okay, and I see what happened on my build. Okay, step base started yesterday at 8 a.m., finished at 2 minutes later. Then step all starting. Okay, and you see it took almost 1 hour to run. And then the run starting. And here in the, I'll switch to the front-end view, the real one. Okay, so here you have links everywhere. Okay, and here you can see the bundle, for instance, and most of things are visible in the front end also. Okay, so you have not really user-friendly information, but once you know what happens, you see all here. That's a bundle, so you have all the batches related to that. Okay, and if I click here, I have the build, which is red. Okay, here I can see. Okay, so step all failed, and here I can check the full all logs, okay, and find if there is an error here. And yes, there is an error because in the, I don't know, sales partner Incoterm, there's something happening, okay. Null value in colon partner ID. Debugging this is not the topic of this talk. Okay. Wow. You're still there? 15 minutes left. I have just a couple of slides about GitHub integration, which is also something you want to set up. Okay. By default, Odoo will, the Runbot will poll the repositories. But if you want to reduce the polling, and that's important if you have lots of repositories, you can set up the mode of the repository to hook and set up a hook on the repository on GitHub. And the trick is, if you're using an organization, you can have a global hook for the organization pinging the Runbot for you. And this, you do it only once. Okay. And this saves a lot of time. Believe me, when you have 130 repositories, as we have in the OCA, you don't want to set it up each time because it's super, it's super annoying. Okay, so if you want to set up for an organization-wide hook, okay, the payload URL is URL of your Runbot server /runbot/hook/org. Okay. Otherwise, you have to use the ID of the remote in your hook. Okay, so use the database ID. And that's on GitHub in settings /settings webhooks. Okay. And you want to send me everything and don't get annoyed with that. I mean, processing a hook, which is not interesting, the hook is filtering the messages for you. So you do that once and you're done for the rest. Okay. So that's for getting notified of a commit or a pull request happening on a remote. Okay, and if you want to do some CI, you want to configure the notifications back. Okay, so to do this, you have to go on, if you're using your GitHub user, which is what I did for this demo, you have to go on settings token on github.com. You may want to have a separate user for that. Okay, you create a new token, so the UI looks like this. Okay, you want to check repo status on public repo. I'm not sure about private repositories. Maybe you need to check the full control of private repositories here. Okay. And this will generate a token, which is a long string. Okay, and you have to copy this on the branch. On the branch here, or on the repository. No, of the remote. I have to fix my, it's on the remote that you set this up. Okay, so here I have a GitHub token, which is normally super secret and you're not supposed to see this. So, but I'll wipe out this instance just afterwards. Anyway, so and that way, when I make a pull request on my test repository, okay, you remember it was red. Here I have my little red cross telling me that CI Runbot has failed. And if I go to details, I get to my build. Okay, bam, you're done. It's super fast, as they say. Okay, I'm done. I hope you survived. And now it's time for questions and answers. You're still there?
Yes. Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for this presentation. Very interesting. It's not really a question, but it's really interesting to see that Runbot is kind of becoming a generic CI infrastructure to run maybe anything you like. Could you say a bit more about what the build Docker image look like and how they are constructed? Or if not, that's all right.
Short answer, I haven't checked that in detail.
Okay.
I mostly figured out how to make it work, and it was not that difficult, but there were a few little gotchas that tripped me, and I hope this presentation will help you avoid the gotchas. And I'll try to improve and make a pull request on Runbot for this. Also, what you may want to check is that there are other modules on Runbot. Okay, there's the Runbot CLA that is used by Odoo to check the CLA of contributions, and Runbot Merge, which is their version of our Gitbot at the OCA that they use to trigger merges, and I think it also can be used to forward port branches or things like that. I haven't checked that in details. Now, the Docker file is here.
Okay.
Nope. Yes. So that's part of my plan. I mean, if I want to work on the integration of Runbot with the OCA, probably I'll need to tweak this one a little bit. Okay, but it's basically an installation of the dependencies. Okay, and they are running things inside this Docker instance. So the magic happens in the file that you're not looking for. If you're looking just in models, it happens here in container.py at the root of Runbot. So that's on my to-do list. Check what's happening in there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I have a question from Frederick, who asks if there is still support for GitLab. Apparently, there was a GitLab support in previous versions.
I believe that GitLab support was added as an OCA add-on.
Okay.
Yeah. That's... Maybe I'm wrong. I don't use GitLab myself.
I don't know either. Yeah.
But Runbot GitLab is here. Hasn't moved a lot, but
yeah. So it looks like it's an OCA done indeed. Yeah.
Okay. By the way, since we are speaking about the Runbot, the version we are running and on which most, to my knowledge, OCA Runbot add-ons work, okay, is on 11 and using this tag, pre-Docker. Okay, so this is the last version of Odoo/Runbot, which is compatible with Runbot Travis to Docker, which is the one we use at OCA. Okay, and possibly Odoo build out Runbot GitLab, and I mean anything on the 11.0 branch requires this pre-Docker tag of Runbot, and the setup is really different.
Yeah.
Well, the main setup, you don't have builds, branches, repositories. All this was added in the last version of Odoo, of the Runbot. But it should be fairly easy to port the Runbot GitLab add-on to using the new version of the framework.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? I don't see any in the chat. Maybe a comment by Yves who says, so Odoo SH is basically Odoo's Runbot.
Plus specific add-ons. But the core, yes, is the Runbot. And if you check Odoo SH, okay, and yeah, I only have okay. You see here the builds. Okay, these are this is a project basically. Okay, and the builds here. This is typically a Runbot. Okay, not exactly the same UI, but still.
Okay. So right now I see no other questions. So thank you so much, Alex, for this very interesting presentation.
You're very welcome. I hope you liked it.
I did. I learned a lot, at least.